Welcome to this researchED at home session. It's great that you can join us today. My name is Matea Marcinko. I'm a fellow at Ambition Institute and I work on our curriculum leadership programmes. Prior to joining Ambition Institute, I worked at English Mastery, which is an ARC incubated venture where I looked at curriculum and helped schools to implement a mastery curriculum across a network of schools or individual schools. Prior to that, I was a teacher at a few London schools. Before that, I was in India teaching. It's great to be here today.
So my name is Paula Delaney and I'm a design manager at Ambition Institute. I'm currently focusing on the early career framework and the early rollout of the early career support programs. I was a teacher for 14 years, both in Ireland and in the UK, mainly based in London, teaching history and sociology, and I was a school leader for about half of that time. I'm also a national leader for Women Ed England, and I'm a governor at an all-tree school in East London as well. So as you may have noticed, we both work for Ambition Institute, which is an education charity with a mission to help teachers and school leaders to keep getting better, especially those who are working in the most disadvantaged communities. We run professional development programs across each career stage, from early career teachers all the way up to CEOs of multi-academy trusts. So I'm going to hand you back over to Matea and she's going to start us off with our session for today.
This session is called Curriculum in a Crisis, Designing Curriculum for a Post-Corona World. In this session, we'll be looking at the core principles of curriculum design in the long term and the medium term towards an understanding of how they can help us to be ready for designing and delivering curriculum in a post-Corona world. I'll be drawing on a paper by my colleague Chloe Wardle on intentional curriculum design, available to download via our website, which draws on the latest research in curriculum and the resources on curriculum we have developed for our suite of programmes for leaders and middle leaders. I will argue that the curriculum principles of review and refine, what and why and focus are a good measure for curriculum design at any time, but particularly now. I will consider how these apply to us through a series of case studies to translate this thinking into the real world. Paula will then turn to thinking about our short-term planning and some of the challenges we are facing in curriculum now and as schools reopen. I will use 3 quotations to frame the long-term and medium-term planning principles, along with some of the mindsets or concerns we might experience in schools when curriculum is at stake. Let's go to the first. I'm a secondary school English teacher by training, so a good adage goes a long way with me. For the benefit of those listening rather than watching this back, I'll read out the quotations. In his 1929 book, The Thing, G.K. Chesterton says, "Do not remove a fence until you know why it was put up in the first place." Chesterton describes the classic case of the reformer who notices something, such as a fence, and fails to see the reason for its existence. However, he cautions before they decide to remove it, they must figure out why it exists in the first place. If they do not do this, they're likely to do more harm than good with its removal. On the surface, Chesterton's fence is a simple principle, but it teaches us an important lesson. Many of the problems we face occur when we intervene with systems without an awareness of what the consequences could be. We shouldn't forget that this applies to subtraction just as much as to addition. If a fence exists, there probably is a reason for it. It may be an illogical or unimportant reason, but it is a reason nonetheless. It is crucial as teachers then that we come to an understanding of our current present so that we more readily can move towards the future. Furthermore, it is critical that we have a true understanding of the problems rather than the effects of the problems alone, so that solutions we work towards are tackling those underlying issues. As schools are in the midst of partial reopening and what will be a long journey back to normal, this idiom seems to ring true of our curriculum work. What will the next year look like? There are many unknowns, which I won't be able to answer here, but hopefully some fences that we will consider not taking down quite yet. One of our curriculum principles is review and refine, which you can see on the screen here. Dylan Williams says that reviewing and refining curriculum is part of every school's regular cycle of improvement and renewal. Schools surely feel this keenly as they've been catapulted into scenario planning for curriculum during lockdown, partial opening, and what we hope will be a full reopening in not too long. So what might reviewing and refining our curriculum look like? This is a good part of any school's natural cycle, so this should work within the systems you already have in place. Draw on the expertise of teachers and educators using the subject leader's expertise within the discipline and the senior leader's understanding of the school's priorities. Collect feedback as part of a systematic approach to curriculum review so that subject leaders can get to the root causes of any problems before planning and implementing change. This will help to avoid quick fixes or large-scale changes when only tweaks are needed. When reviewing long-term and medium-term plans, we might ask these types of questions. How will you work across the school considering your cross-curricular links and how these might flex? What are the key threshold concepts you want students to secure at the end of their time with you? What might we do with less time in our units? From our experience of teaching the content this year, where could we refine our offering? What is our core knowledge and what is our hinterland? How does this cast a light on the content we want to spend time on? How will we endeavour to give our students the best cultural capital available to us, given that we don't know what this will look like under social distancing? What were the best opportunities this year, and what creative ways can we find to make these accessible again in 2021? I had the pleasure of talking to some great schools last week about how they're approaching curriculum during this time, and I'd like to showcase some of their thinking today as well. I've worked with Molly Devlin, the assistant head teacher, EYFS, and now year 1 lead at ARC Academy, along with Lydia Cuddy-Gibbs, head of early years at ARC, on providing long-term and medium-term planning exemplification for our programmes. So I wanted to catch up with her to see how things had been since primaries and nurseries had opened again. As with many schools, Molly explained they're having to continue with online provision alongside having the nursery open. Their current offer includes using the Oak National Academy resources, the Art Curriculum Plus resources, and bespoke curriculum for those students from other year groups who have been invited back, given that there's capacity. Some aspects of the closures that have led to them reviewing and refining their curriculum or their provision include they thought even more about how they can resource parents to support their children. Videos have been provided to help set up child-led play at home and support with phonics. In order to manage the bubbles and social distancing, other adults have been used across the schools. They've created guidance to support these adults in training with formative assessment, watching and waiting to support the children, or during enhanced provision. And these training resources will serve as useful tools for CPD and thinking about their provision as they refine it in the new year. There have been mental health and trauma workshops for teachers to help deal with their baggage they might be returning to and how they can support children with this. This will be an ongoing part of their provision. Children had mostly done well with the rote learning on phonics sounds, so the read, write, think videos that are fantastic but can't be as responsive as we want to be in the classroom. They're now moving on to CVC words and oral blending and getting that practiced across the day. The focus will be on how to do really impactful one-to-one sessions for phonics across all staff to prioritise the content and spotlight children who need more support. The biggest gap for students returning has been in their writing. Either they've made no progress or regress. They would normally be confident writers at this point in reception and would ordinarily go beyond the ELG endpoint. Now this has been pared back so that the skills and knowledge of writing from Spring 1 and Spring 2 are the focus for Summer 2. The topic for this term is growth and change, to better match students' personal journeys and provide an opportunity to explore these discussions rather than using the Spring 2 topic. And they're actually broadening endpoints rather than narrowing them. It's crucial that students are given an opportunity to develop the characteristics of effective learning so that they're well equipped for the rest of their schooling years. Year 1 will continue to do play-based learning in the afternoons so that the opportunity for this is given, with the aim of meeting the reception endpoints of the summer, where possible for the children's development. The leadership structure is adapted to mean that with Molly as Year 1 lead, the adults and children will work across across the year, so that the vision and ethos carries over, as well as the pedagogical knowledge that you need to teach play effectively. So the vision of the school and the early years provision remains the same. The children come first. Developing means trying to limit the stress families might feel to catch up. Developing children takes time. This emphasis on vision is a helpful one and feeds into the thinking for the second quotation I want to share with you. Tom Sherrington says, "Imagine we want to teach children to build sandcastles. There's a very wide range of possible outcomes. What do we have in mind? What's the purpose, the value, the role this plays in a wider view of what they need to know and experience? What type of castle do we have in mind? What level of sophistication and difficulty? We need to devote some time to considering the nature of the castles we want to build." Sherrington's analogy is used here to explore the connection between curriculum and pedagogy. I think this can in part be captured by what we do when we define our curriculum and subject vision. We refer to this collectively as knowing our what and why. At a high level of curriculum planning, thinking about what and why involves making tough decisions about which is the most powerful knowledge to include in the curriculum. For senior leaders, this will mean making judgments about which curriculum areas should be included, and within those, what knowledge should be given precedence. Our purpose of education informs our school vision, which informs our curriculum vision. This is then distilled into subject visions. However, subject visions also need to consider the subject's construct. Every subject is unique. Thinking about what makes your subject unique will also help teachers to select curriculum content. Thinking about what makes each subject unique will also help leaders to select what forms their subject vision. Alignment comes from the curriculum vision, and it's critical to keep these in mind whilst balancing this with subject distinctness. This in turn helps us to establish coherence across the whole school curriculum. By having a clear subject vision, we are better able to work as teachers within our subject communities to review and refine the curriculum that we have on offer. Let's consider how this work is being done in another case study. I spoke to Tom Knott, Assistant Principal at the Totteridge Academy, a secondary comprehensive in North West London. What comes across strongly in their vision is the autonomy given to middle leaders to do what is best for their subjects. This speaks to the importance of subject distinctness and finding what works at the nature of that discipline. Some aspects of the closures that have led to them considering their vision include, in regards to content for next year, unless exam boards say otherwise, middle leaders and senior leaders will work together to consider how to structure and assess. But foundational knowledge in each subject is needed, and there's an important trust of middle leaders knowing the key knowledge that needs to be secure and how that is taught best. How well they know this has been covered will be considered in some testing at the appropriate time, and then looking at those gaps and how those are addressed best in the format available to them as a school. For example, maths and science have the foundational building blocks that need to be covered. Priority topics, you don't move on until that foundational knowledge is in place. This needs to be secure. There's autonomy for heads of department to decide what they think needs to happen, with SLT supporting and probing decisions, and where collaboration could work, for example, across cumulative subjects such as English or history, where helpful. There might be a temptation for some schools to reduce the offer available to students to enhance results in EBAC, but this is something they do not want for their students. The philosophy will be keep up rather than catch up, and using the time they have in school to ensure misconceptions are addressed and students are supported with these before they move on. This consideration of subjects and how visions differ helps to frame my next quotation from Christine Council. In her recent chapter of the researchED Guide to the Curriculum, Christine Council said, "Going the long way round means reading whole novels, plenty of them, having time to talk about responses to them, and reading more. It means getting close to the point of the subject, which is to be constantly changed by the new worlds we acquire as we move through the novel at the pace of the novel and the new conversations we have with others who have read the same. Council gives 6 principles to guide senior leader conversations about curriculum. One of the principles had this phrase about taking the long way round, which really appealed. Council warns against high-stakes assessments that assess the domain through the sample, linking to corrects, rather than really allowing students to get to the point of the subject, the discipline and its nature. As with students' understanding of the subject, rather than taking shortcuts, going the long way round in our curriculum leadership is also critical. Understanding what these important things are in a subject and discipline are important to get right. The principle of focus is a useful one here. Another one of our principles is focus, which you can see on the screen. I'll explain it now in a bit more detail. How does focus help us with curriculum? To avoid breadth trumping depth, we can streamline our curriculum to focus on the most important content. However, we need to be wary of distilling curriculum content down to merely the core and overlooking the importance of the hinterland. Within our most important content, we can identify which are key concepts to which pupils should keep coming back to, which content merits studying in depth, and what pupils need to practice. These decisions are likely to be collaborative between senior leaders and subject leaders, drawing on the senior leader's understanding of the needs of the school and the subject leader's understanding of the subject. Subject leaders can identify key concepts as part of this in-depth long-term planning process, so they can be connected across the curriculum. This will be more important than ever as we consider our students returning to school after a pause in their formal education. Let's consider how one school is focusing their curriculum for the post-corona world. I spoke to John Hutchinson, Assistant Head at Reach Felton, about how they had approached lockdown and what their curriculum plans were for the future. There is focus in regards to both the way that teachers' time is being used, but also in regards to the curriculum. There are lots of unknowns about September, so they've not spent lots of time contingency planning for this. They've kept the principles of their approach simple and not changed things that would have perhaps tightened a process but made it more confusing for parents on balance. The plan when schools reopen is to launch curriculum as intended and adapt as needed, anticipating more of a summer dip than normal. There'll be foundational lessons, maths meetings to cover the key concepts of maths through mastery curriculum. This is going to be number and place value, which is ordinarily practiced more at school, but it's likely to have dropped, so maths meetings will focus on this. There'll be phonics and sentence level writing drill sessions as well. Cumulative subjects will have new topics. In English, they're likely to need to cover writing, since this might have been left behind. Grammar conventions will need to be revisited. Reach follows an explicit instruction and retrieval model in terms of setting out what needs to be taught when. This will be continued, and there'll be revisiting of those concepts, which will be relatively easy to do, as they'll be able to look back to when that content would have been covered in the previous year for exposition and modelling. Parents have been able to see what a lesson looks like. This is what the teacher is asking you to do and what is expected of your child. They might continue to use these videos going forward, and if they're behind, students will have this extra resource to help retrieve and support parents. The phonics videos can also be used to train staff and help to model practice for the induction period. So in summary, some key messages. Review and refine. Curriculum planning and development of subject knowledge is complex, and no curriculum is perfect. Improvement is a continual process, best tackled collaboratively within your internal and external subject communities. Consider your fences. What and why? Think about the powerful knowledge you want pupils to learn, given your vision and values. Consider each subject's unique construct and how knowledge in your subject is created and contested. Consider the castles you want to build. Focus. Think about key concepts that your curriculum will keep coming back to and the supporting hinterland. Given pupils prior knowledge, consider what core content you want them to repeatedly practice and have time to study in depth. What does going the long way round look like in your context? So those are 3 quotations, principles and case studies that might help us to consider curriculum in a post-corona world. Here are some references and resources which might be useful further reading for you. I'll now hand it over to Paula to consider how we might practically prepare and continue to deliver curriculum remotely.
As Matea mentioned, I'm going to be talking about how we can deliver a curriculum remotely. What we do now will impact what our curriculum will look like when we return to full-time face-to-face learning, whether that is in September 2020, January 2021 or beyond. We need to think carefully about the curriculum we are implementing now and how it relates to our longer-term plans and goals. So when partial school shutdowns initially happened, we reverted to what we might call an emergency curriculum provision. Many of us introduced project work, which may have deviated from the intended curriculum, or we focused on revision and consolidation of the intended curriculum which had already been implemented. As remote learning has become the new normal, we've begun to introduce new curriculum content in order to move pupils' learning forward. But how we implement remote learning now will have those longer-term implications on the shape of our curriculum moving forward. And while there is limited evidence which focuses exclusively on our current context, there have been some evidence reviews compiled which consider the situation that we're facing at the moment and how we can best approach remote teaching and learning.
So the EEF, or the Education Endowment Foundation, have completed a review of evidence on remote learning, and they've identified 5 key findings that are outlined here. Now, it would be ideal if we could action all of these findings, but we need to think about what is actually within our control, what's within our sphere of influence, and they're the things we need to focus in on. So things that may be outside of our control are whether or not pupils have access to technology. This in turn will impact whether or not we can set up those peer-to-peer interactions. And it may also influence other factors like our approaches to remote learning. However, we can decide what approaches to remote learning we're going to use to meet the needs of our pupils and our context. That may be online or it may not be. We can also implement strategies that can help to support pupils to work independently. And the most significant factor which we have control and influence over is teaching quality. Teaching, that's where we're experts. The research and evidence tells us that pupils can learn through remote teaching, and many of the characteristics of quality teaching that we would apply within the classroom actually work just as effectively with more implementation. So what we're talking about is breaking down what we want pupils to know and be able to do and being very clear on that. Providing examples and clear explanations, scaffolding to support pupils in learning, and feedback to move their learning forward. So I've gone with what I hope are 3 familiar concepts here: intent, implementation and impact. And what I want to explore is how we can apply these concepts in order to plan and deliver remote learning and implement our curriculum from afar. So the first thing we need to be very clear on is our intent. What do we want pupils to learn? And why do we want them to learn this? Our overarching intent for a curriculum is probably going to stay the same at this point. So our long-term plans are our long-term plans. However, what we want pupils to learn at home, we're going to need to adapt. We need to be thinking about what can pupils learn and do independently, given the resources and support that they have and the amount of time that they will realistically spend working independently. So if we're planning a week of remote learning or even a single lesson, we need to be very clear on what it is we want learners to know and be able to do by the end of that time. And it's also useful to give an estimated amount of time that we want our pupils to spend on learning and developing that content. So once we're clear on what it is we want them to learn, we need to think about implementation. How are we going to support them to actually learn this? Now, in the classroom, here we'd be thinking about the format and the activities we'd use, and we'd be thinking about actually how we're going to deliver this. So using online tools are just one way we can support remote learning, but this in itself can actually take many formats. So remember, great teaching is great teaching, and many of the things we would do for effective classroom implementation apply to remote learning too. Some tips from Paul Kirshner to consider include breaking learning down and communicating that learning as concrete goals and success criteria so that pupils are clear on what they are going to be learning and what they're going to be doing. Framing new material within the larger picture of learning. So getting that buy-in from pupils to consider what is the value in actually giving my attention to this content. referring to prior learning and where to find it. So if there's other resources, textbooks, prior work that might be in their exercise books or online, and really signposting where that would be. Providing examples and models so that pupils know what a good one looks like, what is it that we're aiming to achieve here, and how can we actually achieve it as well. So modelling our thinking process can be very useful as part of this. Offer pupils support during practice, so a way that they can be in contact with you. It doesn't have to be live, but having some system in place where we offer that support. It might actually be resources or a crib sheet where they reference the steps that they need to take. Have pupils process the material by completing tasks that are focused on that material. Review learning with practice and testing. Providing feedback that's going to move pupils' learning forward. And that has other implications for motivation and engagement as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. And spreading exercise over time. So again, considering the amount of time that realistically our pupils will spend on this working independently, and also allowing for some time to forget and retrieve that information as well can be quite useful. Now, there are many different approaches we can take to delivering remote learning. But it's important that we select approaches which are right for us and the skills that we have, our pupils and what resources they have available to them, and our context and the subject content we are trying to teach. And as mentioned, different approaches to remote learning suit different tasks and types of content. If we do decide to go down the route of synchronous or live online lessons, we need to consider the socioeconomic and geographical factors which can impact access to devices and reliable internet connections. Bearing that in mind, we might need to manage the amount of time that pupils are actually live online and use that interaction for the elements of our practice that will have the biggest impact on learning. So thinking about using for instruction, explanation, modelling, providing worked examples, checking understanding and providing feedback. Kirshner again has some great advice on how we can make the most of live online lessons. He suggests that we keep it short. Try not to do all of what you'd normally do in face-to-face lessons in your online class. Prepare it well, know what you're going to say and don't change it during the class. I'd say within reason on this one. We must also be responsive to the needs of the pupils, so that if they're just not getting it, we will need to take action and deviate in some way from what we had in the plan we had in place. Provide structure. So here, talking about sharing our learning goals and success criteria so that pupils can monitor their learning as we go through it. Prepare pupils. If you're going to be talking about something, prepare them beforehand with simulating relevant prior knowledge, and also create an agenda for listening so that pupils are prepared for that learning journey. And that's also going to provide with structure. And he also suggests give short assignments before and after lessons to be submitted to you. Things they can do in a few minutes and you can see whether they are prepared before and understand after. And this is also going to help us to monitor the impact of our curriculum and inform our future planning. And we're going to discuss that shortly as well. Now we've talked about the synchronous element. Online learning doesn't need to be live to be effective. If we're going to go down the asynchronous route, a couple of things to consider. A single source for all remote learning. That can help to ensure ease of access to instructions and materials. Online learning tools such as Google Classroom and Microsoft Teams, which the government has now provided funding for schools to implement where it didn't exist previously, they can help us to create an environment where we store learning in a single secure location. They might not be in your school already, and if you're going to introduce them, then you also need to think about how you will train people to use them. Other platforms, such as Edmodo, allow teachers to host and share learning resources for free, and while some are intuitive to use with a similar format to other learning and networking sites, pupils and possibly parents, depending on the age you're teaching, will require basic training if you want to use that format. There are many online learning resources available as well. So you've Oak National Academy, you've BBC Bitesize, and they're just a couple of examples. If you're going to use them, think about how they fit into your curriculum. You'll need to introduce them as part of the bigger picture of pupils' learning, link them to their prior knowledge because only you know where your pupils are at. You'll need to assess their learning and provide feedback to move your pupils' learning forward as well. So you need to use them and monitor the pupils' learning journey and how they fit into it. You might decide to create your own online online content. It's probably the most reliable way to ensure that learning fits your context, but it can be really time consuming to create. So you need to weigh up the time cost against the immediate and long-term benefits. What I would suggest, if you're going to create content for online learning, focus on content and resources that can make the biggest impact to support pupils' learning. So recording instruction, explanation, modelling, worked examples. And also think about, is this content that can be used to support learning in the future? We don't know what the future is going to hold for remote learning, but also, could this be used as a homework resource to support pupils' learning down the road as well? So if we're going to invest time in those resources, we want that time to really benefit us. Now, we've talked about the synchronous, that live online. We've talked about the asynchronous, where pupils can access resources as and when. Either of those approaches, we also need to think about how we're going to support pupils to manage their time when engaging with online learning. So it might include that we're helping them draw up timetables and highlighting to them where they can go when they get stuck. Important thing to consider, if we're asking parents or carers to support younger learners to access online learning, we need to be sure that they actually have the skills necessarily to access this content and engage them in the process. If online content is not accessible, then we need to be providing alternatives of equal value to learning so that we are not contributing to the widening of education gaps. So textbooks or workbooks and worksheets, which include relevant text, images, models or resources to support learning, can prove to be just as useful as for implementing learning and as tools for learning as the online resources we've just described. And the final phase in our cycle here, impact. How will we know what pupils have learned? Here we need to think about how we're going to assess the impact. So lots of quizzing tools are available as part of those online learning platforms, so Google Forms, Microsoft Forms, where you can set self-marking tests and you can monitor pupils' progress. There are other platforms as well, such as Memrise and Quizlet, which may have existing quizzes that you can use, or you can design and create your own. We might just set a task for pupils to complete and then check their work. If it's synchronous or live learning, depending on the platform you use, most will give pupils the option to share their work with you. And if it's asynchronous, where pupils complete the work and you've set online, then provide very clear instructions as to how, when and where they will need to submit that work. We also need to consider how we provide pupils with feedback to help move their learning forward. So we might just do self-marking quizzes, which tell them if they're right or wrong and ask them to go and follow up and correct those answers. We might give them specific written comments on different pieces of work. Or we may provide office hours where we can be contacted for more individualised support. We could also use some of the work that pupils have produced as models or examples that will inform instruction moving forward as well. Now, the information we gather from assessment is going to inform the intent of our next phase of remote learning. And we'll go through this entire process again to select the best approach to implementation and assess the impact of the next phase of learning. However, that information should also be tracked and monitored so that we can use it when we return to school and full-time face-to-face interactions in the classroom. So that if there was a particularly challenging area of the curriculum that pupils need to revisit or recap, that we can then incorporate that into the curriculum when we return to normality, as it were. So the next thing that I want us to consider when we're implementing this curriculum is, how are we actually going to engage our pupils and, maybe more importantly, our parents and carers to support those pupils as we implement the curriculum remotely? So I've kind of based this around the EAST framework, and this is based on research from Behavioural Insights team. 4 key factors to consider when we're trying to shift behaviours, and in this instance we're shifting the behaviour of pupils because they are having to take on new levels of independent learning that they've never had to do before. But also, parents and carers are now supervising that pupil's learning in their own home, and their level of input is probably going to vary depending on the age of your pupils. But it's important that we communicate with them and engage their support. So the first thing we can consider is make it easy. Harness the power of defaults. So automatic communications are a way to do that. automatic communications with parents about what work is going to be covered in a single day or in a lesson or on a weekly basis might be something that you might consider as well. And this can also be communicated to pupils. But think about how we establish routines around that communication as well, so that it just becomes the norm and it becomes expected. Reduce the hassle factor. Think about how you can use the modes of delivering communication that are already established and easily accessible. Do not underestimate the power of email as a simple way of communicating with parents if that's how you've done it previously. Simplify messages. Break down learning so it's accessible to pupils and provide instructions which can also be easily followed by parents. With young pupils, we may be explicitly communicating instructions with parents and carers. So if providing worksheets and activities, expectations and instructions will need to be very clear for parents and carers so that they can implement them for us. Make it attractive. Attract attention. This may mean considering how we present and lay out remote learning. Having a single source for all work and activities as well. It can also mean how we personalise communication to pupils, parents and carers in a way that, while still being professional, is empathetic and recognises the challenges that we're all currently facing. Design rewards and sanctions for maximum effect. Given the current circumstances, though it may be more beneficial to assume the best, remain positive in our communications, and simply thanking pupils, parents and carers for their efforts and input. Even if this has not been the case, it will establish it as the norm if we recognise it. This can be followed up then by reaching out to individual parents of pupils where engagements may be a concern. Make it social. Show that most people perform the desired behaviour. As mentioned, acknowledging efforts and communications suggests that this is the norm and it encourages others to follow suit. Might use the power of networks. We see many parents and carers are already establishing networks among themselves in order to support their children, but it might be worth considering how you as a teacher could establish a network to support parents. Encourage people to make a commitment to others. By setting timetables for completion of work and communicating these clearly to pupils, as well as parents and carers, we can set that time commitment for remote learning. So if there's a deadline for submitting assessment, be very clear on when that deadline is and when they can expect feedback. And that's also going to help us to make it timely. So other things we can think about are prompting people when they are likely to be most receptive. So we could set up the regular communications that we've already talked about to establish a routine around when remote learning will be shared. Consider the immediate costs and benefits. So by identifying a deadline for the submission of work and providing feedback to move learning forward where possible, we help pupils as well as parents and carers to recognise the immediate benefits of engaging in remote learning. Help people to plan their response to events. So communicate with pupils, parents and carers and offer support within reason to help them identify and address any barriers they have to learning or engaging with the curriculum that you're providing and implementing. By recognising parents and carers' role in the remote learning process, we can work to engage and support them for the benefit of our pupils as a step towards effective implementation of the curriculum and as a way to try and overcome learning loss. Building these relationships between home and school will also have long-term benefits for a post-corona world. So from the 5 key findings identified in that review of evidence on remote learning from the Education Endowment Foundation, we need to think about what's in our control. Ensuring access to technology and providing opportunities for those peer-to-peer interactions that rely on that technology are most likely going to be beyond the control of most of the educators out there. However, we can control the quality of our teaching and apply best practice in what we are providing for our pupils. We can support pupils to work independently in order to improve those learning outcomes, and part of that is working with parents and carers to support them in the home environment. And finally, we can consider the different approaches to remote learning, which suit different tasks and the types of content, but most importantly, suit our own experiences, expertise and skills, and the needs of our pupils and our context. If you'd like any further reading on this topic, I've included the references that I used when I was writing this section of our presentation for today. So hopefully they will be of use to you and inform how you implement remote learning moving forward.
Thank you so much for joining us for our session today, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions at all, please tweet us, and we've left our contact details here.
If you enjoyed this session, you might be interested in the Curriculum Leadership Programme available at Ambition Institute. And this is for senior leaders or those leading on curriculum design in their school who want to develop a vision for the curriculum across a school or a multi-academy trust. And this will be then helping you to roll that out across your middle leadership and to work with your teams across all subject areas and phases. You'll get to dive into more of our curriculum principles. So if you enjoyed that taster, you might like to do some more of that. Applications will open for the next cohort over the summer, so do keep an eye out on our website.